The blade came down on the auction block with a sound like a judge's gavel, and every fisherman, sailor, and trader in the harbor square of Crestfall turned to see who had just been bold enough to bid against Marvin Doss. Seth Fletcher did not raise his hand again. He had raised it once, and that had been enough to buy him a full minute of stunned silence and a crowd of faces that ranged from amused to openly hostile. He stood near the back of the square with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his old fighter's boots planted shoulder-width apart on the wet cobblestones, watching the scene at the front with the particular stillness of a man who had learned, through hard and painful experience, that stillness was its own kind of power. The thing being auctioned was not a thing at all. It was a woman. She stood on the raised wooden platform in the center of the harbor square, as if the platform had been built specifically so that she could look down at everyone in it, and she made that look count. She was an orc woman, tall and powerfully built, her skin the color of deep-sea slate under the gray morning light, her hair the black of wet charcoal and braided thick over one shoulder. She wore fitted travel leathers the color of dark amber that hugged the lines of her body without apology, a lace short jacket over a form-fitting bodice, snug trousers tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles, a wide belt cinched at her waist. There were scars on her forearms and one thin white line that crossed her left cheekbone and said clearly that she had survived whatever made it. She was not shackled. That was the first thing Seth had noticed when he arrived at the square 20 minutes ago and found the auction already in progress. She was not bound, not caged, not weeping. She stood with her arms loose at her sides and her jaw forward, and the crowd kept its distance from the platform the way people keep their distance from a cliff's edge, not because anyone told them to, but because something in them understood the danger of getting too close. Her name, the auctioneer had announced in his sweating, apologetic voice, was Bula Earthshaker. She had come to Crestfall 3 weeks prior on a merchant vessel out of the southern islands, where her late husband, a respected orc trader named Gort, had done business for years. Gort was dead fever, the auctioneer said, though nobody seemed certain, and since Gort had died owing a debt to Marvin Doss, and since Marvin Doss controlled the harbor and the docks and approximately half of whatever passed for law in Crestfall, Marvin Doss had decided that Gort's widow was Gort's most liquid asset. It was not legal, strictly speaking. Very few things Marvin Doss did were legal, strictly speaking. Seth had heard the auction announcement that morning while eating salt fish at the Harbor Inn, and he had told himself it was none of his business. He had told himself the same thing while he pulled on his coat. He had continued telling himself that all the way down to the square, where he arrived just in time to hear Doss's man open the bidding at 40 silver and watch every person in the crowd look anywhere but at the platform. He had raised his hand, not because he knew her, not because he had a plan, because watching her stand there on that platform while a crowd of cowards studied their own boots made something cold and furious move through him, and he was, at his core, constitutionally incapable of staying quiet when a thing was wrong. He bid 60 silver. Marvin Doss, who was a wide man with a red merchant's coat and the kind of confidence that comes from never once having been punched in the face, turned from his position beside the platform and looked at Seth with the expression of a man identifying a very small insect. 65, Doss said. 70, Seth said. The crowd made a sound. Not words, just a collective intake of breath. The sound of a group of people deciding whether to be horrified or entertained. And then the woman on the platform looked at Seth Fletcher for the first time, and Seth understood, all at once and with complete clarity, that he had just made his life significantly more complicated. Her eyes were dark amber, almost gold, and they moved over him the way a sailor checks the horizon for weather rapidly, efficiently, and without illusion. She clocked his scarred knuckles, his fighter's posture, the old dueling blade at his hip, and whatever she found in his face. He had no idea what she concluded. But something shifted in the set of her shoulders, just slightly, the way a boulder shifts before it decides to roll. 75, Doss said, and his voice had lost its amusement. I don't actually have 80 silver, Seth said loudly, to no one in particular, so I'm going to have to try something else. He walked through the crowd. People moved. Not because he was large. He was average height lean, with the kind of economy of movement that came from years of training the waste out of every gesture. But because there was something in the way he crossed the cobblestones that made people decide they needed to be somewhere other than in his path. He walked up the 3 steps to the platform. The auctioneer made a high sound and backed away. Seth stopped in front of Bula Earthshaker, looked up at her. She was a good 3 inches taller than him, and said, quietly and for her ears alone, "I don't have the money to buy you and I'm not trying to own you. But I have a proposal that might get both of us out of this square without anyone bleeding. Do you want to hear it?" For 3 full seconds she said nothing. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he felt the full weight of her assessment and did not flinch away from it, because flinching was not a language she would respect. "You are either very brave," she said, her voice low and accented with the rolling cadence of the southern islands, "or very stupid." "Probably both," Seth said. "The proposal stands." Something happened in her face then. It was not a smile, it was too subtle for a smile, just the faintest relaxation around her eyes, but Seth would remember it later in quieter moments, as the moment Bula Earthshaker decided he was worth talking to. "Say it fast," she said. "We are betrothed," Seth said. "As of this morning," which means under Crestfall harbor law, any debt belonging to your late husband cannot be collected against you while you are under the protection of a legal pledge. Das knows the law. He just assumed no one would invoke it for an orc woman. Her eyes did not widen, but they changed, shifting from assessment to something sharper. "Is this true?" "Yes." "Can you prove the pledge?" Seth raised his voice. "I invoke the harbor pledge under the Charter of Crestfall, 2nd Article, right of protection for betrothed persons against debt collection on behalf of a deceased third party." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document, not a betrothal certificate, because he had not had one this morning, but a trading license he had renewed last week that, from a distance, looked official enough to sow doubt. "I have papers." The square went extremely quiet. Marvin Das's face moved through several colors. "That is," the auctioneer began. "A legal invocation," said a woman near the front of the crowd, a harbor magistrate's clerk named Dina, whom Seth had done a favor for once, a small but useful favor, and who now stepped forward with the particular expression of someone choosing a side. "The charter provision is real. I can verify it." Das stared at Seth across the square with eyes like 2 coals pressed into bread dough. "This is not finished," he said. "Probably not," Seth agreed pleasantly. "But it's finished for today." He turned to Bula. She was looking at him with an expression that was part fury, part something else he couldn't name yet, and she said very quietly, "I did not agree to be pledged to anyone." "No," Seth said. "You didn't, and you don't have to stay pledged. It's a fiction. I'm giving you a way off this platform." Another silence. Her eyes moved over his face again, looking for the angle, looking for what he wanted from this. He kept his expression open and let her look, because he had nothing to hide and he thought she would know it. "Fine," she said at last, the word clipped and precise. "But I want it on record that I am deeply unhappy about this." "Noted," Seth said. She stepped down from the platform and the crowd parted for her the way it had parted for Seth, but with considerably more urgency. He walked beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. He would think about that later too, how naturally he had taken that position, but at the time he was focused on the space between his shoulder blades, which was the space that Marvin Das's eyes were currently burning through. They made it to the end of the square before she grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadow of a salt store doorway with a grip that would have left bruises on a man with less conditioning, and she turned on him with her back to the wall and her arms crossed, and everything about her body language saying that if he made one wrong move she would put him through the door behind her. "What do you actually want?" she demanded. "I want breakfast," Seth said. "I haven't finished it. And I want to know what Marvin Das actually wants with you, because it's not 40 silver worth of debt. Nobody auctions a widow for 40 silver. That stopped her. He watched her process. It watched the shift from defensive fury to something more calculating and cold. "No," she said slowly. "No, they don't. There is something Das wants from you," Seth said. "Something worth enough that he went through the theater of an auction instead of just having you robbed in an alley. He wants it publicly and legally transferred to his possession." He tilted his head. "What is it?" Her jaw was very tight. "That is not your concern." "I just pledged myself to you in front of 200 people and Marvin Das," Seth said. "Which means Das is going to spend the next several days deciding how badly he wants to cause me problems. I think it is fairly substantially my concern." Bula Earthshaker stared at him for a long moment. The morning fog was still moving through the harbor behind him, and the sound of the dispersing crowd and the creak of ships rigging filled the silence between them. Then she reached under the collar of her jacket and pulled out a cord. On the cord hung a small iron key on one side and on the other, wrapped in dark cloth, an object the size of her palm that she unwrapped just enough for him to see the edge of it. Stone, old stone, carved with a spiral pattern he did not recognize. The surface of it seemed to catch the gray light and hold it differently than stone should. "My husband's family's hearthstone," she said. "Given to his line 6 generations ago by a spirit keeper of the Deep Rock clan. It has no power that you could measure in silver, but Gort's family will come to Crestfall to reclaim it. They are 4 days out by ship, and the man who holds that stone when they arrive is the man who holds Gort's trade routes, his harbor permits, his contracts." She rewrapped it and tucked it back beneath her collar. "Marvin Das wants those contracts. He wants the stone. He believes that if he owns me, the stone transfers to him." Seth absorbed this. "Does it?" "No, it transfers to the eldest of Gort's bloodline, which is his brother Rolk. I am holding it for Rolk because Gort asked me to with his last breath. That is all." Her voice did not crack, but it thinned slightly on the last words, the thinning of someone who has been holding grief so tight for so long that it has become structural. Seth was quiet for a moment. Then, "So you need to stay alive and in possession of that stone for 4 days. "Yes, and Das will try to take it." "He already tried twice," she said flatly. "The second time, 2 of his men needed a physician." Looking at her, Seth did not doubt this. "All right," he said. He held out his hand. "Seth Fletcher. Former pit fighter, current man without a plan but with a good room at the Harbor Inn and a fairly healthy appetite for complicated situations. I am offering you a temporary and completely fictional betrothal and 4 days of whatever help I can provide. In exchange, I want nothing from you." She looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at his face. "Why?" she asked, and it was not a suspicious question. It was a real one, direct and blunt and deserving of a real answer. "Because you were standing on that platform," Seth said, "and nobody else was going to do anything." He said it simply, without drama, because it was simply true, and he had learned long ago that truth lands harder without decoration. She took his hand. Her grip was extraordinary, not showing off, just natural, and she shook it once firmly. "Bula Earthshaker," she said, "I am giving you a temporary and completely fictional betrothal in exchange for not getting you killed, which will require significant effort on my part." "I appreciate the warning," Seth said. "It was not a warning," she said. "It was a fact." But her eyes, just for a moment, showed something that might have been the very earliest edge of a smile. He noticed it. He filed it away in the growing collection of small things about her that he had already decided he could not stop himself from noticing. They went and ate breakfast. It was, all things considered, an unusual morning. The harbor in that Seth was staying at was called the Anchor's Rest, and it sat at the end of a long wharf where the fishing boats came in before dawn and filled the air with brine and the sound of men arguing about prices. The innkeeper, a broad woman named Petta, had the look of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by none of it in 20 years, and she gave Bula Earthshaker the same blank, appraising look she gave every new guest and then gave Seth a room key without comment. He gave Bula his room. It was on the upper floor, the corner room, with a window that looked both ways along the wharf and a heavy bolt on the inside. She examined the bolt, examined the window, looked at both exits, and then turned to him. "Where will you sleep?" "Common room," Seth said. "I've slept in worse places." "The common room is not defensible," she said. "I'm not worried about defense," he said. "I'm hard to kill, and Das doesn't know yet that I'm anything other than a man with a lucky law citation and a trading license. He'll spend today gathering information. We have tonight." Bula looked at him with the expression of someone revising their estimate upward. "You think like a fighter," she said. "I was one," he said. "Were," she noted. "Retired," he said. "6 months ago, I came to Crestfall because I'd heard the fishing was excellent and the people left you alone. How is that working out?" Seth considered this seriously. "Mixed results so far." She sat down on the edge of the bed. Not relaxing, no part of her body was relaxed but thinking, and she let him see her think, which he understood was a kind of trust. "Rolk's ship is the Iron Prow," she said. "It will enter the harbor in 4 days, probably on the morning tide. If I can get the stone to Rolk, Das has nothing. He cannot claim Gort's contracts without the stone and Rolk's mark on the harbor ledger." "Can Das intercept the Iron Prow before it enters harbor?" She hesitated. "He has 2 ships." "Then we don't wait for the Iron Prow," Seth said. "We take a boat out to meet it." She looked at him. "You sail." "Badly," he said. "But I can manage a 2-man coastal runner if the weather holds. And Das won't expect it because it's not the kind of thing a sensible person does." "That is either brave," she said, and there was the echo of what she'd said on the platform, "or very stupid." "Or both," Seth agreed. This time she did smile. Just briefly, just the corner of her mouth quickly controlled. But he caught it and he thought about it later, alone in the common room with the fire dying down. And he made himself stop thinking about it because 4 days was 4 days, and a fictional betrothal was a fictional betrothal, and she was a widow still raw from grief. But he thought about it anyway. The next morning she came down to the common room before dawn, already dressed, and found him at a table with a harbor chart spread out and a mug of tea going cold at his elbow. She sat across from him without ceremony and studied the chart. "You've been awake all night," she said. "I sleep badly," he said. "Occupational habit. Are you hungry?" "Yes." He got up and came back with bread and smoked fish and a pot of tea and set it on the chart between them. And they ate while they planned, and it was the most naturally comfortable silence Seth had had with another person in longer than he could easily name. He noticed that too, and told himself firmly to focus. "Das will have a man watching the inn," she said, pulling off a piece of bread. "He had one watching last night," Seth said. "Thin fellow, bad coat, standing near the fish-curing shed across the wharf." She raised an eyebrow. "You saw him?" "I used to read rooms for a living," Seth said. "Fights start when you stop reading rooms." She nodded. "He will also approach you directly, probably today. He will offer to make the betrothal problem disappear if you step aside." "And if I don't step aside?" "Then he will try to make you disappear," she said matter-of-factly. "I appreciate the directness," Seth said. "I am always direct," she said, and looked at him over the rim of her tea mug with those amber eyes, and he had the distinct and inconvenient sensation of the ground shifting slightly under him, which had nothing to do with the tide. "Good," he said. "So am I." He set down his mug. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Ask." "The stone. There is something else about it. You held onto it through an auction and 2 altercations with Das's men and a sea voyage and a fever death. You are not holding onto it purely because Gort asked you to. What else does it mean to you?" A long pause. She set down her bread. "It is the only thing left of him," she said. "Not the only object, the only thing that still holds something of who he was. When I hold it I can still—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It is not rational." "It doesn't have to be rational," Seth said quietly. "It just has to be true." She looked at him with a kind of careful attention, as if she was not sure what to do with gentleness aimed directly at her. "He was a good man," she said. "He was not grand or dramatic. He was steady. He made me feel steady." She looked down at the table. "I have not felt steady since." Seth said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry." "Do not be sorry," she said briskly, reassembling her armor. "Be useful." "Yes, ma'am," Seth said. She looked at him sharply, checking for mockery, and found none. Something in her settled slightly, the way a door settles into its frame when you get the hinges right. Das's man came that afternoon. Not Das himself, that would have been beneath him, but a large, comfortable-looking man named Vass who walked into the Anchor's Rest, while Seth was at the bar discussing tides with the innkeeper, and sat down next to him with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be feared. "Marvin Das sends his regards," Vass said. "How kind," Seth said. He also sends a question. "Your betrothal claim, strange as it is, Das is not a man without grace. He is willing to consider that it was a genuine declaration made in haste. He is willing to forgive the 60 silver bid which you never paid. He is willing to offer you 40 silver and no hard feelings if you remember that you made an error in the harbor square and go back to whatever hole you came from." Seth drank his ale. He took his time with it. "I came from Grayville," he said. "Southwest, 6 days up the road. Good town. Not a hole." He set the mug down. "Tell Marvin Das that the betrothal stands and the harbor charter stands, and that if he wants to challenge it, he is welcome to bring it before the harbor magistrate." Vass's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did. "The harbor magistrate works for Das. Then he has nothing to worry about, does he?" Seth said. Vass stood. He was a head taller than Seth and considerably broader, and he let that fact be present in the air between them without saying anything about it. Seth looked up at him with the unconcerned expression of a man who had stood in a pit with things considerably more dangerous than Vass and walked out the other side. "You were a fighter," Vass said. "Pit fighting, I've heard of you. Seth Fletcher, the ghost of Grayville, they called you. 3 years undefeated in the Grayville pits." "That was a while ago," Seth said. "Das will want to know if you are still what you were." "Tell him," Seth said, "that I'm retired and that I would very much prefer to stay that way, and that everyone's life is simpler if this situation resolves itself without anyone bleeding." Vass left. Seth sat with his ale for another moment and then went upstairs and found Bula at the window of his room, watching the wharf. "I heard," she said without turning. "Vass, him, yes, and I heard you." She turned then and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, which was the expression she wore when she was recalculating something. "You could still walk away from this." "I could," Seth agreed. "Why don't you?" It was the same question as before from the salt store doorway, but it meant something different now, a day and a half in, now that she was a real person in front of him and not just a woman on a platform. He thought about answering truthfully. Then he thought that the truthful answer, that he had not been this interested in any situation, including himself, in the 6 months since he'd retired, and that she was the most compelling person he'd encountered in a good deal longer than that, was probably not a useful thing to say at this particular moment. "Because I'm already involved," he said instead, "and I don't leave things half-finished." She studied him. "Is that the only reason?" He held her gaze. "No," another silence. A charged one, different from the comfortable silences with more current running through it. "What is the other reason?" she asked. "It would be rude to say," Seth said. "You just lost your husband, you're in a complicated situation, you don't need me adding complications." Bula Earthshaker looked at him for a long moment and then said with perfect composure, "You are being considerate of my feelings." "Trying to, yes." "I am not fragile," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not why." "Then why?" "Because," Seth said carefully, "I think you are worth being careful with, and I don't want to be another thing that shows up needing something from you." She was quiet for long enough that the sounds of the harbor filled the room, the creak of ropes, the cry of gulls, someone on the wharf below shouting about herring prices. "That is," she said at last, "an unusual thing for a man to say." "I'm an unusual man," Seth said, and meant it without vanity. She turned back to the window. But the line of her shoulders had changed, and Seth, who was good at reading bodies, read this one correctly. Something had shifted, and it was not unwelcome, and she had decided not to examine it yet. Good enough, he thought. Good enough for now. They spent the rest of the day quietly as two people in a guarded room in a harbor town with a powerful enemy could be quiet. Bula showed him the stone properly that evening in the low lamplight, unwrapping it fully and setting it on the table between them. It was about the size of a large fist, gray and dark-veined, with the spiral carving running all the way around it in a single continuous line. In the lamplight it did seem to hold the light strangely, the way water holds it, moving slightly even when the stone was still. "Deep Rock clan craft," she said. "I am not of Gort's clan. I was born into the Seawind Orc of the Southern Islands. Different traditions. But I can feel that this is made with intent. A spirit keeper laid something into it." Seth reached out and touched the edge of it. It was warm, warmer than the room's temperature should account for, and something in his fingertips recognized the warmth as meaningful in a way he couldn't articulate. "What does it do?" he asked. "I don't know." Gort never fully explained. She looked at it with a complicated expression. "He said it kept the family's luck. He said as long as it was with his blood, the sea and the trade winds would be kind to them." A pause. "The ship he was on when the fever took him was carrying the stone with him. He gave it to me before he died. He made me promise." She met Seth's eyes across the table. He was afraid Rolk would not come for it. He thought Das might try to buy Rolk's claim. "Can Das do that?" "Rolk is not an easy man," she said slowly. "He loves his family's legacy, but he has debts of his own, and Das has reach even into the southern island ports." She wrapped the stone again carefully. "I need Rolk to hold it in his hands. If he holds it and sees its value, he will not sell. And if he doesn't," she tucked it away, "then I will have failed Gort, and I do not intend to fail Gort." There was something so absolute in the way she said it that Seth felt the full weight of what she was carrying. Not just grief, but responsibility and loyalty stacked together into something immovable. And he understood, with the clarity that sometimes hit him when he paid enough attention to a person, that Bula Earthshaker was not primarily fierce because she was strong. She was fierce because she had decided, long ago and completely, that the people she loved would not be failed by her. That was the source of all of it, the squared shoulders, the amber eyes that gave nothing away, the way she had stood on that auction platform without flinching. She had decided Gort would not be failed even after his death. Seth thought that was one of the most extraordinary things about her, and he thought it quietly, sitting across from her in the lamplight with the sounds of the harbor around them, and he did not say it. Later she asked, with the tone of someone assembling a case from available data, the pit fighting, "You won for 3 years and then you stopped." "Yes." "What made you stop?" Seth was quiet for a moment. "I won a fight I should have lost," he said. "The man I fought, he was good, genuinely good. Better than me on paper. But I was better at reading him than he was at reading me, and I found his opening and I took it." At his hands. He was in a bad way afterward, nothing permanent but bad enough. And I was standing over him and thinking, I've been doing this for 3 years and I'm still here because I'm good at finding the crack in someone and hitting it. And I thought, is that what I am? Is that all I am? "It is not all you are," Bula said. "No," he agreed. "But it was starting to be, so I stopped before it finished becoming the whole of me." "What have you been doing since?" "Wandering," he said. "Looking for something to do with myself that wasn't hitting people." A pause. "Not with great success, as this morning demonstrated." Her mouth curved. "You hit no one this morning." "I have hope for tomorrow," he said. She laughed. A real laugh, short and low, surprised out of her the sound of something that had not been used in a while but still knew how to work. She caught it quickly and settled her expression again, but too late. Seth smiled at her. He couldn't help it. She looked at him with a kind of wariness that was clearly fighting with something warmer and said, "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" he asked. Like she stopped, looked away. "Like I am something good." "You are something good," he said simply. The wariness won, but only by a narrow margin, and she looked back at the window and said, "We should sleep. We have a long day tomorrow." "We do," Seth agreed. He went down to the common room. He lay down on the bench near the fire and stared at the low beams above him and thought about the sound of her laughing, and the way she'd said it was not all he was, and the warm weight of the stone under his fingertips, and he told himself firmly that this was a temporary situation and a fictional arrangement, and 4 days was 4 days. He was aware that he was not convincing himself. The second day brought Das's real move. It did not come from the direction Seth expected. He was at the harbor market in the morning, buying supplies for their planned sail. Bula had insisted on helping him choose, and she knew more about provisioning a coastal runner than he did, which he freely admitted, when a man walked up and put a knife to Bula's ribs from the left while Seth was on her right with his arms full of rope. It was elegantly done. The crowd was thick and loud, and the knife was small and close to her body, and anyone not looking directly at it would see nothing unusual. "Give me the stone," the man said. He was young, nervous, sweating despite the cold morning. Das's man, but a low one, the kind sent because he was expendable. Seth set the rope down slowly. Bula said nothing. She was looking straight ahead, very still, and Seth could see that she was already calculating and that her calculation had arrived at a place that ended badly for the young man with the knife, and that she was waiting only to see if there was a better option. Seth said pleasantly to the man, "Before you go any further with this, and I'm not saying don't, I'm just saying before you do, I want to show you something." The man's eyes moved to Seth. Seth turned his right hand palm down and let the man see the knuckles. Old scars, deep ones, the specific scarring of a pit fighter's hands after years of bare-knuckle work. "I'm retired," Seth said. "But retirement doesn't change the hands. I want you to look at those and then think about whether Marvin Das is paying you enough to make this worth it." The young man looked at the knuckles. He swallowed. "She has the stone," he said, but with less conviction. "She also has a knife of her own in her left hand," Seth said, "which she's been holding since you appeared and which is probably already against your stomach. I can't see it from here, but I know her." The young man looked down. Bula pressed the tip of her blade just slightly. He made a sound. "Walk away," Seth said. "Tell Das she's better protected than he thought." That's useful information for him, and it keeps you intact, which should matter to you. The young man walked away very quickly. Bula put her blade away and picked up the rope Seth had set down. "You said you know me," she said. "I do know you," Seth said. "You had the knife out before he finished his first sentence." "Correct." She handed him the rope end to coil. "You are not bad to have around." "High praise," Seth said. "It is," she said seriously. "I do not say things I do not mean." They finished buying supplies. That afternoon, returning to the inn, Bula stopped walking. Seth, 2 steps ahead, turned to find her standing in the narrow harbor street looking at him with an expression that he could not immediately parse, too many things in it, overlapping. "Ask," he said. "The game we are playing," she said. "The fictional betrothal, the pretend courtship. Everyone in this harbor sees us together. They see you protect me. They see." She stopped, began again. "What do you actually want from me? Not from the situation, from me." Seth looked at her for a long moment in the cold gray afternoon with the sea wind pushing at both of them and the smell of salt and tar in the air. "Truthfully," he said. "Always truthfully," she said. "I want to keep doing this," he said. "After the 4 days. After Rolk arrives and the stone is safe. I want to keep talking to you and arguing with you about rope and watching you be terrifyingly competent at everything you do and sitting across a table from you in the lamplight." He held her gaze. "I want that to be real, but I understand if you need time, and I understand if you don't want it at all, and I'm not going to make either of those things harder for you by pushing." She was very still. The sea wind moved her hair. "The grief is real," she said. "It does not go away because a man with interesting knuckles shows up." "I know," Seth said. "But," she said and paused. "But the world feels less like a threat when you are in it. I have not felt that since Gort." She looked down at her own hands. "I do not know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "You can just let it be true." She looked up at him. "You are very patient." "I told you I used to fight for a living. Patience is how you survive." "In fighting," she said, "patience is how you wait for the opening." He smiled. "Yes, it is." Something moved through her expression, warm and complicated, and she stepped forward until she was close enough that he had to tilt his head slightly to hold her gaze, and she said, low and direct, "If this is not fictional, then it should not be practiced. When it is real, it will be real." She reached up and touched his jaw with 2 fingers, a brief, deliberate contact that went through him like a struck note. "Understood." "Understood," Seth said. She dropped her hand. "Good. Now come. We need to check the tides. The third day was the day everything accelerated. Das moved through official channels, filing a challenge to the betrothal claim with the harbor magistrate, who was, as Vass had told Seth, in Das's pocket. The challenge hearing was set for the following morning, which was the morning before the ironprow was expected in the harbor. If Das could get the betrothal dissolved before the ironprow arrived, he could make another attempt for the stone before Rolk got ashore. Dina, the magistrate's clerk, came to the Anchor's Rest that evening looking uncomfortable and smelling of recent guilt. The magistrate will rule for Das, she told them, standing in the doorway of the inn's back room while Bula watched her from the corner with her arms folded and her expression doing most of the heavy lifting. The hearing is a formality. He'll declare the claim invalid on procedural grounds. That's corruption, Seth said. Yes, it is, Dina agreed miserably. I can't stop it, but I can tell you that the magistrate's authority only extends to the harbor quarter. If you were to make the betrothal official and public in the town square in front of the town council, not just the harbor magistrate, it falls under civil charter, not harbor charter, and Das has no purchase on the town council. Not yet. A public declaration, Seth said. Tonight, Dina said. The council meets in the evening. They'll be at the common meeting house until the 9th bell. If you walk in and declare before them, it's registered under civil law and the magistrate's ruling tomorrow means nothing. Dina left. Seth looked at Bula. We don't have to do this, he said. We can take the boat out tonight early and meet the ironprow in open water. Skip the hole. No, Bula said. Her voice was steady and final. I will not let Das's magistrate rule on my life and give him the fiction that he won. I will not hide on a boat. She met Seth's eyes. I will stand in the town square and I will be seen, and Rolk will arrive tomorrow to find that his brother's widow stood her ground and was not moved. That is, Seth said, an extremely Bula Earthshaker thing to say. Yes, she said, it is. She paused. Will you stand with me? He looked at her and thought, not for the first time, that she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in his entire life, and that he was going to be in significant emotional trouble very shortly if he was not careful, and that he was not going to be careful. Yes, he said, I will stand with you. They went to the town council meeting together. The council meeting was already in progress when they arrived, 8 men and 2 women seated around a long table in the town's common house, working through a list of harbor business that covered things like disputed fish prices and the matter of a fence line. The room smelled of tallow candles and old wood, and the 20 or so townspeople in the gallery went quiet in a way that was only slightly less dramatic than the harbor square auction when Seth opened the door and walked in with Bula beside him. The council chair, a weathered woman named Hearth who had the look of someone who had outlasted several Marvin Dasses in her time, peered at them over her spectacles. Seth Fletcher, she said, and the orc widow, Bula Earthshaker. She looked around the table. I have been expecting something interesting to walk through that door all evening. Continue. Seth stepped forward. He stated the betrothal claim clearly, gave the charter citation from memory because he had spent the better part of the previous night memorizing it, referenced the harbor auction and the stone, and the debt dispute in enough detail that 2 council members were already leaning forward with the expressions of people who had been suspicious of Marvin Das for some time and were delighted to have grounds for it. Then Marvin Das arrived. He came through the side door of the common house with Vass and 3 other men, and the red merchant's coat, and the face of a man who had been tipped off and was not remotely amused. This is irregular, Das said to the council. This is my meeting house, Hearth said pleasantly, and this is a civil claim filed in my presence which makes it council business. Sit down or leave, Marvin. The woman is carrying stolen property, Das said. He pointed at Bula. The hearthstone of the Gort trading family was pledged as debt collateral. I have papers. Those papers, Bula said, and her voice carried through the whole room without effort, are fraudulent. My husband Gort signed no such pledge. I was with him at his death and I read his affairs. He owed you 40 silver for a harbor docking fee that was itself inflated beyond the charter rate. You have no standing here, Das said to her. You are not a citizen of Crestfall. She is my betrothed, Seth said, which under civil charter gives her standing. That betrothal is being challenged in the harbor court, Seth said. This is the civil council. You do not have the same magistrate here, Marvin. Harth removed her spectacles and set them on the table. The betrothal claim is noted and recorded in civil ledger as of this hour. The hearthstone and its ownership will be adjudicated when the Gort family representative arrives tomorrow, at which time the family's own testimony will be entered. She looked at Das. Unless you have testimony from the Gort family you'd like to enter tonight. She knew he didn't. She knew perfectly well he didn't. Das stared at Seth across the long table. Seth met the stare comfortably. This is not over, Das said. I keep hearing that, Seth said. What happened next would be talked about in Crestfall for some time. Das turned to go, and as he did, one of the townspeople in the gallery, a dockworker who had been at the harbor auction the previous morning and who had been drinking since, shouted that Marvin Das was a crook who had been watering the harbor fees and skimming the catch taxes for 3 years. And did the council want to hear about it, because he had a ledger? He did have a ledger. He pulled it from inside his coat and held it up. The council meeting went entirely off its original agenda. Das did not leave. He could not leave, because leaving would have looked like confirmation, and he knew it. He stayed, his face white, while his affairs were aired in front of the council and the townspeople and Seth Fletcher, who stood with his arms crossed near the back of the room, and watched with the expression of a man watching something satisfying happen naturally. Bula stood beside him, and at some point during the heated discussion about catch taxes, her shoulder pressed against his. He felt her warmth through the leather of her jacket. He did not move away. After a moment, she didn't either. She turned her head and looked at him in profile. He turned and looked at her. That dockworker, she said quietly, you spoke to him. I had a conversation earlier today, Seth said, about general things, grievances, ledgers. You planned this, she said. I thought it was a reasonable contingency, Seth said. She studied him. I did not know you had done that. You were provisioning the boat, he said. I did not want to distract you. She looked at him for a long moment while the noise of the meeting churned around them, and her expression was the one he could not always read, the layered one, with too many things in it at once. Then she reached up, as she had done in the street the previous day, but this time not 2 fingers to his jaw. This time she took his face in both her hands and kissed him. It was not a polite kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who had decided something and intended for that decision to be fully understood, and Seth was briefly, for the first and only time in his adult life, completely at a loss for any kind of strategy or analysis, because every thought in his head went quiet. She drew back. Her hands were still on his face, and she was looking at him with those amber eyes that were currently warmer than lamplight. Still fictional, she said softly. I have sincerely lost track, Seth said. She smiled. Not the corner of the mouth, quickly controlled version. The real one, wide and rare and extraordinary, and he thought he would happily cause a significant amount of chaos on a regular basis if it would produce that smile. Good, she said, and lowered her hands. The meeting continued. Das was, by the end of it, facing a formal council inquiry into his harbor fee practices, which meant his authority over the harbor magistrate was about to become considerably more precarious. It was not a complete solution. Das still had ships and men and the particular resilience of a man who had survived a great deal, but it was damage. Real damage. They walked back to the Anchor's Rest in the dark, with the harbor lights reflected on the wet cobblestones and the cold wind off the water, and neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was full, not empty. At the door of the inn, Bula stopped. The boat, she said. Tomorrow before dawn we go out to meet the iron prow. Yes, Seth said. Das will have people watching the dock. Yes, we should go very early. 3rd bell, Seth agreed. She nodded. She did not go inside yet. Seth, she said. Yes, I have been thinking about what you said, about wanting to keep doing this after the 4 days. Bula, you don't have to. I am not fragile, she said. I told you. Thinking clearly, she looked at the harbor, at the lights on the water. Gort was steady. He made me feel steady. I told you this. She turned back to Seth. You do not make me feel steady. He waited. You make me feel awake, she said. Like the sea on a cold morning, like the world is larger than I remembered. A pause. I have not felt that before, not even with Gort. It is different. She met his eyes. I do not know what to do with it still, but I know I do not want it to stop. Seth breathed in the cold, salt air and looked at her and said, Then we don't let it stop. No, she agreed. We don't. She went inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the harbor and feeling the specific, clean, almost frightening quality of happiness that comes when you have been a long time without it, and recognize it suddenly by the way it changes the weight of air in your lungs. Third Bell found them on the dock in the dark, loading the coastal runner by feel and low lantern light. The boat was a two-masted skiff, 12 feet, flat-bottomed and quick in shallow coastal water, the kind of boat that fishermen used to work the rocky shallows, and that was easier to handle in early morning calm than anything larger. Bula knew boats. Of course she knew boats. She had grown up on the southern islands, and the knowledge of how to move on water was in her body the way fighting was in Seth's body, unthinking and certain. She rigged the sail in the dark without hesitation, while Seth handled the mooring lines, and they were out of the dock and into the harbor before the gray of pre-dawn had properly established itself. Doss's watchman saw them. He had been stationed near the dock house, and by the time he gathered himself and shouted and ran for Doss's ship, they were already past the harbor mouth and into the open coastal water. The morning was cold and the sea was dark gray and choppy with the overnight wind, and Seth handled the tiller while Bula managed the sail with an efficiency that left him nothing useful to do on that side. He focused on reading the water and keeping them on a northeast heading, toward where the iron prow would be running down the coast. You are not bad at this either, she said, braced against the mast, watching him work the tiller. I spent some time on coastal traders, he said, before the pits. You have done a great many things, she said. I am difficult to categorize, he agreed. She laughed again, and the cold wind took the sound and he stored it away. They saw the iron prow's sails at mid-morning, dark against the gray sky, running southeast on the same coast. Seth steered them onto an intercept course, and Bula pulled them closer to the wind, and the small skiff made a pace that surprised him. As they closed, he saw Doss's ship too, one of his two vessels, larger, heavier, faster in a straight run but slower to tack, currently on a course to intercept the iron prow from the harbor side. He's going to beat us to the iron prow if we don't get there first, Seth said. Bula looked at the angle, at both ships, at the wind. She made a decision and re-rigged the sail in a way that Seth would not have thought to attempt, cutting the angle so sharply that the skiff heeled and spray came over the bow and soaked them both. It was cold enough to take the breath away. Bula's hair was plastered to the side of her face and she was braced at the mast in the spray, and the wind and her expression was fierce and alive and entirely in her element. And Seth thought, with salt water in his eyes and both hands on the tiller, that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They reached the iron prow first, just by perhaps 2 ship lengths. The iron prow was a well-built Southern Island merchant vessel, and the man who came to its rail to look down at the shouting, spray-soaked woman in the tiny skiff was stocky and dark-browed and had Gort's cheekbones in his face, which Seth recognized from the miniature Bula carried. "Rolk," she called up to him in the Orc tongue of the Southern Islands, then shifted to the trade language. "Gort's brother, I am Bula. I have the stone. I am coming aboard." Rolk stared at her, then at Seth. "Who is the human?" "He is mine," Bula said, with such casual and complete certainty that Seth felt it land in the center of his chest like a hand placed there deliberately. There was a brief and complicated moment where Doss's ship, which had been attempting to intercept the iron prow from the other side, found itself being firmly denied approach by the iron prow's crew, who had not forgotten that Marvin Doss had previously tried to buy Rolk's family debt and had made no friends doing it. On the iron prow's deck, Bula gave Rolk the stone. Seth watched from nearby as she placed it in Rolk's hands, and the man closed his fingers around it, and something changed in his face, something private, deep, the shift of a man who has been expecting to feel loss and instead feels something coming home. He pressed it to his chest and bent his head, and Bula put her hand on his shoulder and said something quiet in the island tongue that Seth did not catch. Then Rolk straightened. He looked at Seth. "You helped her," he said. "We helped each other," Seth said. Rolk considered this. He was the kind of man who took his time reaching conclusions which Seth recognized as wisdom. Finally he said, "My brother trusted her. She trusted you. I will register the stone and the contracts at the Crestfall Civil Council today, and the harbor debt will be formally disputed." He looked back at Bula. "You have done what you promised him. He would be at ease." Bula nodded. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, and she looked out at the gray sea for a moment while Rolk gave orders to his crew, and Seth moved to stand beside her at the rail, not saying anything, just there. After a moment she said without looking at him, "It is done." "It is done," he agreed. "I kept my promise to Gort." "You did. I can now," she stopped, began again more carefully. "I can now decide what I am doing next without the weight of it." "Yes," Seth said. She looked at him. "What are you doing next?" He kept his eyes on the water and said, "I am not going back to Grayville." "No, no, I like it here," he said. "The fishing is good and the people are interesting." "One of the people," she said. "One of the people is exceptional," he said. The quiet stretch between them, full and warm even in the cold, salt wind. "If you stay in Crestfall," she said, "you will need a better room than the common room of the Anchor's Rest." "I will," he agreed. "There is a house at the north end of the harbor," she said, "that Gort's family held a lease on for trade purposes. Rolk has said I may use it through the winter if I choose to stay." A pause. "It has 2 rooms." "2 is a useful number," Seth said, and turned to look at her. "I am not ready," she said, directly, clearly, without apology. "For all of it. I am not there yet, but I want you present. I want you near." She held his gaze. "Is that enough?" "Yes," Seth said without hesitation. "That is more than enough." She reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the spray, and she held on with the grip of a woman who did not do things halfway. He held on back. They sailed back to Crestfall with the iron prow behind them and Das's ship standing off. And Bula held his hand the whole way, and neither of them said much. And it was one of the best conversations Seth Fletcher had ever had. Rolk arrived at the Civil Council that afternoon with the hearthstone and a formal statement that obliterated Das's fraudulent debt claim on 3 separate charter grounds. And the council accepted it with the evident satisfaction of people who had been looking for a proper legal mechanism to address Marvin Das's various activities, and were pleased to have one land in their laps. Das appeared at the council meeting. He had clearly spent the morning revising his position and arrived looking like a man who had decided that the better part of valor was to be present and cooperative and to minimize his exposure. Seth arrived at the same meeting. This was not, strictly speaking, necessary. Rolk's statement was sufficient. The legal work was done. Seth could have stayed at the inn and eaten the plate of fish stew he had been planning on all morning. He went because he knew Das would try one more thing. Not a legal thing, that avenue was closing, but something else. A final move to undermine the betrothal claim, perhaps, or a suggestion to Rolk that Bula had not acted in the family's best interest, some lever that would let Das chip away at what had been built. And he was right. Das waited until the formal proceedings had concluded and Rolk had received his acknowledgement from the council, and then Das raised his voice in the gallery and said, clearly and for the room, "The betrothal claim is still under challenge. The man Fletcher filed it under duress in the harbor square. He has never met this woman before this week. He has no standing to make a claim for her protection, and the whole arrangement was a legal fiction from the start. I call for the betrothal to be reviewed." The room went quiet. Seth felt Bula beside him go very still. Harth, the council chair, looked at Seth. Seth stood up. What he said next was not planned. He did not have a prepared argument. He had, in fact, been intending to say something brief and legal and get on with his fish stew. What came out instead was this. "The betrothal was a fiction when I made it," he said. "That's true. I won't stand in this council and say otherwise. I made it because a woman I had never met was standing on a platform that she should not have been on, and the law was being used as a weapon against her, and I was not willing to be in the same room as that and do nothing." He looked at Hearth, then at the council, then at Das, and then, because this was the part that actually mattered, at Bula. "It was a fiction when I made it. It is not a fiction now. I am not asking this council for legal protection or official blessing or anything else that Marvin Das can challenge. I am telling you, and everyone in this room, that this woman is remarkable and that I am not pretending about any of it anymore, and that if Marvin Das has a problem with that, he can take it up with her, and I will enjoy watching." Bula Earthshaker looked at him across the council hall with those amber eyes, and something in her face that was the total opposite of warning, open and warm and completely unguarded. The first time since he'd known her that all the armor was down at once. The room was very quiet. Then Rolk, from his seat at the table, said, to no one in particular, "I like this human." Hearth tapped the table once. "The betrothal claim stands. Next matter." Das sat down. He was not finished in the broader sense. Men like Das were rarely finished in the broader sense, but he was finished here and he knew it, and the knowing was visible on his face. Seth sat back down. Bula's hand found his under the table. Her grip was firm and deliberate, and she did not look at him, but the pressure of her fingers said everything they needed to say. He held on. He had been doing that a lot lately, he reflected, holding on. To her hand, to this place, to this unexpected and completely unplanned life that was assembling itself around him like something that had been waiting for him to show up. He thought of the common room of the Anchor's Rest, and the lamplit table with the map and the cold tea, and the sound of her surprising laugh, and the feel of her hands on his face in the meeting house, and the salt spray on the way to meet the iron prow. He thought of how he had left Grayville 6 months ago with the specific and hollow feeling of a man who has put down the one thing he knew how to do and has no idea what to pick up next. He had been, and was now willing to admit it to himself, deeply lonely. Not in the dramatic way of a man who complains about it, but in the quiet structural way of a man who has arranged his life so efficiently around one skill that when the skill is gone, there is nothing underneath it. He had not known what he was looking for when he came to Crestfall. He had genuinely thought it was the fishing. He knew now that it was not the fishing. The council meeting adjourned. Rolk and his men went to register the contracts. Das left without further incident. The townspeople dispersed with the energetic air of people who had been present for something that would be discussed for weeks. Seth and Bula walked out into the late afternoon light, which was pale and golden on the harbor water, and they stood on the wharf with the gulls overhead and the fishing boats coming in and the smell of salt and smoke and sea. "The house at the north end," Bula said. "Yes," Seth said. "Rolk has agreed. It is ours through the winter." "Ours," Seth said. She looked at him sidelong. "Unless you have objections." "None," he said. "Not a single one." "Good." She started walking. He walked beside her. They moved through the harbor streets in the late light, the long familiar streets that Seth was beginning to know, the salt store, the fish market, the meeting house with its crooked chimney, and Bula walked with the long, easy stride of a woman entirely in her own right, powerful and certain, and Seth matched her pace without effort because matching her pace was already natural. The house at the north end of the harbor was built of gray stone, squat and solid against the rocky headland, with a view of the sea from its upper window and a heavy door that opened onto a small courtyard. It smelled of old wood and sea air. It had a hearth that needed cleaning and a table that needed mending and 2 high-backed chairs that did not match each other and were comfortable for different reasons. They stood in the main room in the dying light while the sea moved outside the window and said nothing for a moment. Then Bula turned to him and said, with the directness that was entirely her own, "I am going to say something." "Say it," Seth said. "I told you I was not ready," she said. I told you I needed time. I mean that I am still raw in places, and grief does not vanish because the situation resolves. Gort was real and his loss is real. She paused. But I also told you that you make me feel awake. That is also real. Both things can be true. Both things can absolutely be true, Seth said. So she looked at him with those direct, warm, amber eyes. I am not asking you to rush anything. I am asking you to be here, fully here, not with one eye on the door and your bags packed, a beat. You have a habit of leaving. I do, he admitted. I am asking you to stop that habit, she said. He looked at her in the quiet room with the sea light through the window and said, I stopped it the moment you took my hand on the iron prow. She crossed the room to him. 2 steps, deliberate, and she took his face in her hands again as she had in the meeting house. And this time the kiss was not for the benefit of a room full of people and political calculation. It was for them and only for them, and it was everything the other one had promised, warm and certain and hungry. Her hands in his hair and his arms around her, and the cold, salt air of Crestfall filling the room around them like a blessing. They stayed in that room as the light failed outside, and the fire needed lighting, and Seth lit it while Bula pulled the chairs closer and they sat in the firelight and talked for a long time about Gort. Because she needed to talk about him and Seth needed to let her, about the pits in Greyville, about the southern islands and the orc traditions of the Seawind clan, about what it felt like to be extraordinarily good at a thing you could no longer do, about grief and patience, and the strange way that life assembles itself when you are not watching carefully enough to prevent it. She asked him to tell her about the worst fight he'd ever been in, and he did, and she told him about the worst storm she'd ever sailed through, and he listened. And they argued pleasantly about whether a coastal runner could be handled solo in rough weather. She said yes. He said only if you were her. And she said that was basically yes, and he said fine, yes. The fire burned down and they rebuilt it, and somewhere in the middle of a discussion about harbor tides that had been going for 20 minutes, she stopped talking mid-sentence and simply looked at him. What? He said. You, she said. You are. She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly, fighting something, and then she let it go. You are what I did not know I was hoping for. The words were quiet and precise, and landed with the weight of something she had been considering for longer than this week. Seth set down the cup he was holding. He reached across the narrow space between the mismatched chairs and took her hand. She turned her palm up and closed her fingers around his, and the grip was the same as it had been on the boat, firm and complete, not letting go. You are what I did not know I needed, he said. Or that I was allowed to have. She looked at him. Allowed. I spent 3 years in a pit proving I was useful, he said. And then I stopped, and I could not figure out what I was for without the pits. I wandered around for 6 months being, he paused. Hollow. And now, she said. Now, he said, I know what I am for. She was quiet for a moment, then very softly, tell me. This, he said, you. Her hand tightened on his. Outside, the harbor of Crestfall was going about its evening business, the lanterns on the fishing boats bobbing in the dark water, the gulls settling, the tide running in against the rocky headland below the house with its patient, centuries-old sound. Inside, the fire was warm and the room was small, and they were both present, fully present, not managing a situation or executing a plan, or being useful in the particular way that useful people are useful when they're covering over the places where they hurt. Just present. Later, much later, when the fire was low and the harbor was quiet, they moved from the chairs to the narrow window seat, side by side, with the dark sea below them. Bula leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they watched the water in silence that was the best kind of silence. The kind that holds everything already said and needs no addition. He pressed his lips to her temple and she turned her face up to his, and they stayed that way for a while, unhurried in the warmth of each other. Seth, she said at some point, yes, what you said in the council hall. I meant every word, he said. I know, she said. I know you did, that is why I am saying it. She turned to look at him properly. I have been used to moving through the world alone. Even with Gort was steady, but we traveled separately much of the time, and I was used to my own company and my own defense and my own decisions." She paused. Having someone stand up and say those things in a room full of people about me, I did not know what it felt like. "What did it feel like?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she did anything. "Like being seen," she said. "Not as a threat or a curiosity or an obstacle, like being fully seen and someone deciding out loud and for everyone that what they saw was worth standing up for." Seth held her tighter. "It was," he said. "It is." She exhaled slowly and settled against him, and something in her settled that had not been fully settled for a long time, a tension that had been structural, holding the whole shape of her upright and defended and forward-facing through the months of grief and the weeks of danger, finally releasing, because it did not need to hold that position anymore. He felt it happen. He held her through it quietly without comment, because she did not need comment. The night was long and the sea was patient and they were warm. There was still the matter of Marvin Das. In the following days, the council inquiry that the dockworkers' ledger had triggered moved faster than such things usually moved, primarily because the dockworker turned out to have 3 friends with similarly detailed records of Das's practices, and because Hearth was a woman who, once started on a thing, did not stop. Within a week, Das's harbor authority was formally suspended pending the inquiry, which stripped him of most of the mechanisms he used to make his various pressures effective. He did not leave Crestfall. He was not the kind of man who left, and his roots here were too deep. But he was reduced, and reduced men have less reach, and the stone was with Rolk and the contracts were registered, and the betrothal was on the civil ledger. Rolk left on the 3rd day after his arrival, the iron prow loaded with Gort's trade goods and headed south to home ports. Before he went, he stood with Bula on the dock in the early morning and talked for a long time in the island tongue, and Seth waited at a respectful distance and watched the sea. When Rolk came to him before boarding, he looked Seth over carefully once more and then said, "My brother's widow is not a woman who needs protection. She needs someone worth protecting." "I know," Seth said. "She has chosen you," Rolk said. "With a Seawind orc, the choosing is not a small thing. When she says you are hers, she means it in every possible sense for as long as she means it, which in my experience with Seawind women is the rest of their lives." "I understand," Seth said. Rolk studied him. "Do you want that?" "Yes," Seth said, without a single moment of hesitation. Rolk nodded slowly. "Then prove it with your years, not your words." He turned and went aboard. Seth stood on the dock after the iron prow had gone, watching the sails disappear around the headland, and thought about years. He had been using up years on things that had not added up to much: fights, wandering, the long hollow months of retirement. He thought of Bula and the stone house on the harbor headland and the mismatched chairs and the fire and the sound of the sea and her hand in his on the boat, and he thought, "Yes, I will prove it with my years." He walked back to the house. She was at the window when he came in, watching the harbor the way she often did in the morning, and she turned when she heard the door. "He is gone," she said. "Yes," Seth said. "The stone is with its family." She nodded. She had said what she needed to say to Rolk, and the rest was settled, and she was. He could see it clearly now, at rest in a way she had not been when he met her. The grief was still there, it would be for a long time. Real losses do not evaporate, but it was no longer the weight that she was carrying upright against gravity. It had become part of her, held, not endured. She looked at him across the room. "So," she said. "So," he said. "What now?" Seth looked around the room, the hearth he had cleaned out and rebuilt, the table he had mended with a new leg, the mismatched chairs that had become theirs, the window with the sea beyond it. "Breakfast," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, and this time she did not control it or contain it. It was full and rich and real, the laugh of a woman who has fought hard for a long time and has arrived, finally, somewhere safe enough to let her guard all the way down. Seth went to the hearth to start the fire for breakfast, and she came and sat at the table, and the morning light came through the window and across the stone floor, and the harbor sounds came with it, the gulls and the boats and the water, and it was the simplest thing in the world, which was also the largest thing in the world. He set the pan over the fire and looked back at her, and she was watching him with the full warmth of her amber eyes, unhidden and unguarded, the fierce orc widow who had stood on an auction platform like a warning to the entire world and had then, in spite of everything she knew about the world and what it did to people who opened their hands, decided to trust what was in his. She had chosen him, not because she had to. Not because he had rescued her. She would have survived Marvin Das with or without him, and they both knew it. But because, in the specific way that people with extraordinary strength sometimes choose, she had looked at him clearly and fully and decided that he was worth it. He thought that no one who had watched him in the Grayville pits, no one who had called him the ghost of Grayville and wagered on whether he would survive the night, would have predicted that this was where the ghost would end up, in a stone house on a gray coast with a woman whose laugh could change the quality of morning light, making breakfast. He thought it was the best thing he had ever done with his life. Eggs, he said. Obviously, Bula said, he cooked eggs. She mended the latch on the courtyard door that had been loose since they moved in. They ate at the mended table in the morning light and argued about whether the coastal runner needed new rigging before winter, and he said it probably did, and she said it definitely did and she had already ordered it, and he said he would have been happy to contribute to that decision, and she said she had assessed the rigging while he was sleeping and made a practical determination. I was going to assess the rigging, he said. When? She said he thought about it. This afternoon. The rope merchant closes at noon, she said, and ate another piece of bread. Seth looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has realized that his life is going to be substantially organized by a woman who is better at most things than him, and who intends to do them before he gets around to them, and that this is actually excellent. Fine, he said. Yes, she agreed. After breakfast she cleared the table and he washed the pots, which was a small domestic thing and therefore the most natural thing in the world. And when he straightened up from the basin, she was standing close behind him and he turned and she was looking at him with an expression that was not about eggs or rigging. He wiped his hands. He met her eyes. She stepped forward and closed the last of the distance between them, and her hands came to his chest, resting there with a warm and deliberate weight, and he put his arms around her and held her, and she let herself be held, which he understood by now was not a small thing. I am still working out, she said, her voice quiet against his shoulder, how much of this I am allowed. All of it, he said. You are allowed all of it. She was quiet for a moment. You should know, she said, that when a sea-wind orc takes a person as hers, it is not light. It is not a thing she tries and discards. It is a claim, in the full sense. She pulled back enough to look at him. I said on the iron prow that you were mine. I meant it in that sense. I want you to understand what I meant. Seth looked at her, at the directness and vulnerability braided together in her face, and said, I am yours. I have been yours since you stepped off that platform and told me you were deeply unhappy about the situation. Her mouth curved. That was very early. Yes, he said, it was. You decided that quickly. I decided, Seth said, the way you do when you read a fight correctly, you know before you can explain it. Every tell, every movement, you just know. He held her gaze. I knew. She looked at him for a long, full moment. Then she reached up and touched the side of his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw as if learning it, and he stood still under her hands as he had stood still in the harbor square under her assessment, because some forms of attention deserved stillness. Then it is settled, she said softly. It is, he said. She leaned in and kissed him, and it was warm and sure, with no pretense in it, no fiction, no calculation, just the two of them in a stone house on a gray coast in the morning, and the sea outside and all the time they needed. Later in the day, when the light had shifted and the harbor was busy with the midday catch coming in, Seth went down to the docks to check on the skiff and ran into Dina, the magistrate's clerk, who was heading toward the harbor offices with a ledger under her arm and an expression of bureaucratic satisfaction. The inquiry is proceeding, she told him. with the particular relish of someone who has been wanting to say those words for some time. Das will not have his harbor authority back. The fee assessments are being audited. She paused. You two will be comfortable here. Yes, Seth said simply. We will. He watched the fishing boats come in and thought about comfort. It was a word he had not applied to his life for a long time. Comfort was what you lost when you went into the pits, when you spent every day sharpening yourself into an instrument of survival. He had been sharp for a long time. He did not regret it. Sharpness had kept him alive and had taught him to read rooms and read people and read Bula Earthshaker, which was the best thing his training had ever produced. But comfort was what the sharpness had been paid for in the end. The right to be comfortable, the right to have a fire and a mended table and breakfast made and a woman's laugh in the morning air. He went back to the house on the headland. She was outside in the small courtyard, sharpening her blade with a whetstone in the focused quiet of long habit. She looked up when he came through the gate, and the look she gave him was the one that she did not seem to know she gave him, the one that meant he had been away and was now back, and that this was good. He sat on the low stone wall and watched her work. Anything from the dock, she asked. The skiff is fine, he said, and the inquiry is moving. Good. He watched the whetstone move in its slow, certain arc and thought about Rolk's words. Prove it with your years. He intended to. He had, for the first time in his life, a clear picture of how he wanted to use them. Bula, he said. She looked up. I want to stay here, he said. In Crestfall, with you, not temporarily, not as a convenient arrangement. He met her eyes across the courtyard. I want this to be where I am. She lowered the whetstone. She looked at him for a moment with the full, unhurried attention she gave to things that mattered. Then she said quietly, where you are is where I am. It was a Seawind Orc's way of saying yes, which was also a Seawind Orc's way of saying everything. He crossed the courtyard and she rose from her seat, and he took her face in his hands on his wrists, and kissed her in the cold afternoon light with the harbor sounds below and the sea beyond and the future somewhere ahead of them, assembled and whole. When they drew apart, she rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes, and he held her there in the courtyard with his arms around her and the gray winter sky above them and the cold salt wind making ghosts of their breath. She was fierce and complicated and guarded and extraordinary, and she had moved through the world like a warning for a long time, and he had moved toward her anyway, and she had finally, completely, and without reservation forgotten to growl. And Seth Fletcher, who had spent 6 months looking for something to be for and had wandered into Crestfall looking for fish and quiet, understood at last what he had been looking for. He was looking for her. She had been looking without knowing it for him. The harbor went about its business below them. The tide came in. The gulls argued. The fire in the house would need rebuilding in an hour or so. They stayed in the courtyard a while longer because there was no urgency left, and the cold was nothing, and the loneliness that had lived so long in the structure of his bones was gone, not absent, but replaced, filled in, built over by something warm and permanent and entirely his. Hers. Theirs. The sea kept moving, the same as it always had, and the harbor of Crestfall was exactly as it was on any other winter afternoon, noisy and salt-smelling, and indifferent to small human histories. But in the small courtyard of the stone house on the North Headland, something had ended that needed ending and something had begun that intended to last, and both of those things were true at the same moment, which is the exact definition of a beginning. She pulled back just far enough to look at him. I should finish sharpening the blade, she said. Yes, he said, and you should check the fire. Yes, he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then she smiled, the full, real, rare smile that he had been collecting like something precious since the moment he first saw it, and she stepped back and picked up the whetstone, and he turned and went inside to the fire. And that was how it began in earnest. Not with a ceremony or a declaration or a grand moment that could be pointed to and named, but with a blade being sharpened in a courtyard and a fire being rebuilt inside, and the ordinary miracle of two people who had been, separately, incomplete, becoming together enough.